Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I'm also someone who had never, ever read anything by James Baldwin before I just finished Giovanni's Room, which honestly seems like some sort of major malfunction on my part. James Baldwin, incredible, incredible. I had 3 of his books all queued up. I had Go Tell It on the Mountain, The Fire Next Time, and Giovanni's Room, and I think was just like waiting for the right moment. And the right moment came after I discovered the work through my daughter of Candice Lynn. Candice Lynn is a really important contemporary artist. She works with a lot of different media. And has a work from not too long ago called A Hard White Body. The beginning of it actually involves a urinal, which is very cool in lots of ways. And after there is a urinal, you move into a part of the exhibition where she has essentially remade Giovanni's Room out of unfired clay. And when that unfired clay is left over time, it essentially begins to decay. Candice Lynn's work was very interesting to me. I knew that James Baldwin, was a Black writer and was really involved in the civil rights movement. And I knew nothing about Giovanni's Room. It's also a book that my younger son loved, so I was really, really excited to dive in. I read Giovanni's Room really quickly. I think it is a book that actually lends itself to quick reading, but I can tell already that it is also a book that I will need to reread because of the richness of the text. There is so much happening in this book, but one of the things that was most notable to me was the use of figurative language. So what we're going to do today is look at Giovanni's Room almost exclusively through this lens of the incredible figurative language used by James Baldwin. For those of you who like an agenda, we'll talk briefly about the biography of James Baldwin. We'll then dive in looking at the cover art, the title, the dedication, some blurbs, and the opening. Then we're going to look at figurative language and the way that various sort of motifs and various metaphors really stand out throughout the book. Of course, as we go through and are looking at the figurative language, this is just also sort of a great excuse to look at the amazing prose and to look at the breadth and the scope of this brief novel. I should say right at the start that figurative language is essentially any time that language is doing more than simply denoting something. So you think about sophomore English. Think about metaphor, simile, personification, symbolism, foreshadowing. All of those ways where, you have language that's telling you one thing but has a different nuance and is sort of doing more work. But we're going to be looking fairly specifically at these different motifs because they will open the novel in lots of different ways for us. We're going to begin with the idea of windows. We're then going to look at the idea of water and then the sea and the ocean more specifically. We are, of course, going to spend some time looking at the room and how the room manifests itself. We're going to look at birds. And then we're going to close by looking at the role of mirrors, which feature very heavily in the beginning and the end. We're going to dive in with the biography of James Baldwin. So as always, I will say that the biographical information is less interesting to me than the text that we're going to look at closely, but I just got all of this. It's literally all from Wikipedia. I do think it's nice to have this in mind as we look at the text. But do keep in mind that this is not a historical lecture. This is a literary lecture, and I'm giving you these biographical data in order just to ground you. So James Arthur Jones was born in Harlem. His mother was a single mother. He never, in fact, knew who his biological father was. There were rumors that he was someone who was involved in drugs and maybe died. His mother married Mr. Baldwin. I don't know Mr. Baldwin's first name. And she went on then to have 8 children. So he was born in 1924 and died in Paris in December of 1987. What I have gathered from Wikipedia led me to believe that James Baldwin's relationship with his stepfather, who was much, much older than his mother, and in fact may have been born during enslavement, and really was someone who was very, very concerned with salvation and with Christianity, and really essentially wanted God to have revenge on white people, which is 100% understandable. He sounds like someone who was very full of wrath. I'm saying wrath because it feels kind of biblical, and I think he was very biblical in lots of ways. They had a very contentious relationship. Apparently, according to Wikipedia, it almost got physical sometimes. And again, there were 8 younger siblings. Baldwin had to work hard as a young man just to sort of keep things afloat and to provide support for his family. His stepfather actually died, I think, on the day maybe that his youngest sibling was born. His educational trajectory is really impressive to me. So he went to some public schools in New York City and was totally inspired by a few teachers. He read widely, but was reading Dickens or something already by 4th grade. So he clearly very brainy, clearly very drawn to books. He went to Frederick Douglass Junior High School and continued with this academic emphasis. He then went to DeWitt Clinton High School. This is all in Harlem. Oh no, that was in the Bronx, but he grew up in Harlem. And he's sort of at the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance, during adolescence and his early adulthood. That would have been, as the Harlem Renaissance was sort of coming to a close. So he went to this high school that was predominantly white and predominantly Jewish, and was very happy there, worked on the high school paper. His yearbook quote was something like, "Fame is the spur, ouch." So essentially, was someone who was fairly ambitious, from all I can tell was well-liked. I think already in high school, if not soon thereafter, understood, in fact, that he was attracted to men, had some ambivalence about that, but seems fairly open, especially for someone, this would have been the late 30s, early 40s. In 1943, when he was 24 years old, he went to Paris and spent 9 years there and had a bunch of different relationships with different people, some with men at that point. He met 2 men in particular became, sort of obsessions for him, again, according to Wikipedia. One of them was Lucien, to whom Giovanni's Room is dedicated. So this is someone who was 17 years old at the time. Again, James Baldwin was 24, and he was Swiss, this young man. He had come to Paris for adventure, and at one point they went back to his home in Switzerland, and James Baldwin wrote a very important essay about how interesting it was to be in a place where being a Black person was novel, but where, the Swiss people didn't have all of the prejudice that, in fact, the Americans hold. So he writes a lot about how it feels to be a Black person in Europe. Largely, he went to Europe because he was interested in this idea of less racial prejudice there. When he was 33, he went back to the United States. That was in 1957. But at that point, he had already been incredibly successful in terms of his literary career. In 1953, he wrote Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is, sort of a coming-of-age Bildungsroman type novel. And, oh my gosh, those of you on the YouTube, I just made some sort of hand motion and like a weird little thumbs up bubble just came popping up. In 1955, he wrote Notes of a Native Son, and in 1956, he wrote Giovanni's Room. When it was published, it was very controversial. There is, relatively explicit homosexual activity in here. But I also am just so appreciative that it was published. Right around this time is when Lolita is not being published by anybody in the United States and needs to be published by the Olympia Press in France. And clearly, this is a book that is very different from Lolita. Giovanni's Room is not talking about anything that is criminal or untoward, whereas Lolita, of course, is talking about something that is deplorable and criminal, although it is literally my favorite novel. So we have this very important book that comes out. It does cause quite a stir, and yet Baldwin went on to have an enormous amount of literary acclaim. He was also an extremely important voice in the civil rights movement of the 60s, which, that cannot be stressed enough. Giovanni's Room is a relatively young James Baldwin as an author, and that also is just so impressive and sort of shocking that he would have the maturity to write this well as someone in his 20s. We are going to dive in by taking a look at the cover of the book. So I like these covers. Mine are the vintage ones. They have James Baldwin in very big letters because, of course, he is the draw, James Baldwin being so well known. And then in smaller font, the title of each one of the works. I didn't know, there's a really great picture of James Baldwin himself on the cover of The Fire Next Time. I was wondering if this Go Tell It on the Mountain was a picture of him as a young boy. It seemed unlikely, and in fact, it is not, which is slightly misleading, but I also like it. I think that's totally fine with me. The cover of Giovanni's room, it's like a very kind of stock-ish kind of photo. It's attractive. It has, some wine and some coffee cup looking things and like a rattan chair. It looks very French. So in that regard, I do like it. Does this say Giovanni's room to me? I'm not sure. It's I don't know what I really want, but this is fine. The cover art on the first edition is amazing. If you're watching on the YouTube, I will put it up for you. It's kind of a green and blackish. It's very abstract. And then when you look at it more, it resolves into a face. Okay, I do really love the title. It seems sort of obvious in some ways, but it's really not. I mean, it seems obvious in part because it's become sort of iconic. What I like about it too is that it really focuses our attention on this figurative language that we are going to talk about. Giovanni's room, in fact, becomes a metaphor for what these young men are struggling with. And it's a really beautiful use of language. I also like the way that Giovanni's room is focusing us also on Giovanni. So we have David, who is our protagonist, but Giovanni is obviously, as the object of David's affection, he is much more, the more sort of important person in some ways. I mean, that's not really true. David is certainly the more interesting and the more, knowable and the more compelling in some ways character. He's the one we're following. It's really his story, and he's the one we're most, sort of rooting for. But I really like the idea of Giovanni as being so much in the focus because it sort of aligns us with David in terms of being, sort of having Giovanni as front and center. Usually we wouldn't take the time to read these blurbs at the beginning, but there are two I want to touch on in my edition here. The first is by Langston Hughes, who is obviously an extremely important Black poet. He writes this about Baldwin. He is thought-provoking, tantalizing, irritating, abusing, and amusing. And he uses words as the sea uses waves to flow and beat, advance and retreat, rise and take a bow in disappearing. The thought becomes poetry, and the poetry illuminates the thought. I love this. I mean, first of all, extremely high praise coming from Langston Hughes. I also love how really poetical, this actual blurb is. It's a really beautiful depiction of the novel. It's also just like a beautiful depiction of literature in general, this idea of retreating and advancing. And we also have this from Norman Mailer. So Norman Mailer is someone who James Baldwin knew and befriended. And, he's kind of a crusty old white dude who's known for being misogynistic. He says something very concise. He has become one of the few writers of our time. I mean, it's very, very high praise, obviously, from one of the other, big writers of the time. Okay, we are now going to turn the page and we find the dedication. It says right here, for Lucien, I am the man, I suffered, I was there. Whitman. This is a line of poetry from Walt Whitman, who was an extremely important poet earlier than them, and a very important sort of gay icon. So Lucien Happersberger was a Swiss boy. He was 17 years old, as I mentioned, when they met. He became James's lover and his obsession. And in fact, very much like we see in Giovanni's room, Lucien begins a relationship with a woman, and James Baldwin is just undone by this. At some point, he has another person that he falls in love with, I believe, in Paris. There is a suicide attempt on the part of James Baldwin at some point in Paris, although he immediately regrets it and has a friend come over. And on Wikipedia, it says, help him regurgitate whatever medication he had taken, which I just thought was, it's a terrible episode for James Baldwin, but regurgitate just kind of killed me. I have to also confess that I fell into the trap that I think a lot of people do because the book is written in first person and because I know that a lot of James Baldwin's novels are very autobiographical. I assumed that one of the characters would be Black. Very early on, he makes it clear that both of the men in the novel are not Black, they're white. Oh my gosh, I put up my two fingers to show two men, and like suddenly there were balloons and confetti all over the screen. iMovie is really loving this lecture. So I was a little bit surprised that the two men were, that neither of them was Black, but that is a very important thing that James Baldwin acknowledged at the time, which is that he did not want to be pigeonholed as a Black writer. And it's extremely important because, again, he was very involved in the civil rights movement and really spoke out very vehemently as a Black man. But I think this idea of being versatile enough to also be able to tell the story of gay love between two men as not having any sort of race attached to it is really very, it's very important and something that, it's an important aspect certainly of the novel. So unlike some lectures, I am essentially going to assume that you have read Giovanni's Room. If you haven't, I won't, spoil anything without letting you know that I'm about to spoil something. But I will say that this is a book that is absolutely fascinating to go back to the beginning. So it is one of these books where this first-person narrator, David, is telling us this story, and he begins it at the difficult moment in the future and then works back in time. So it's very interesting once you have finished the novel to go back and look at the opening, because there is so much information in the beginning that you don't really fully apprehend and comprehend at the very, very beginning because you don't have enough context for it. But if you've read the novel, then all of this information that is imparted at the beginning is so important and so interesting. It's really cool to go back and look at the beginning. I'm going to read this a little bit at length, partially because it is cool to go back and look at it, but also it's going to launch us very nicely into this study of figurative language. I stand at the window of this great house in the south of France as night falls, the night which is leading me to the most terrible morning of my life. I have a drink in my hand, there is a bottle at my elbow. I watch my reflection in the darkening gleam of the window pane. My reflection is tall, perhaps rather like an arrow. My blonde hair gleams. My face is like a face you have seen many times. My ancestors conquered a continent, pushing across death-laden plains until they came to an ocean which faced away from Europe into a darker past. I may be drunk by morning, but that will not do any good. I shall take the train to Paris anyway. The train will be the same, the people struggling for comfort and even dignity on the straight-backed wooden third-class seats will be the same, and I will be the same. We will ride through the same changing countryside northward, leaving behind the olive trees and the sea and all the glory of the stormy southern sky into the mist and the rain of Paris. Then a little further down, there will be a girl smiling opposite me who will wonder why I have not been flirting with her, who will be set on edge by the presence of the recruits. It will all be the same, only I will be stiller. Then a little further down. My girl Hella and I had rented this house. She has been gone a week. She is on the high seas now, on her way back to America. I can see her, very elegant, tense, and glittering, surrounded by the light which fills the salon of the ocean liner, drinking rather too fast, and laughing and watching the men. So this is so, so beautiful and so impactful. At the very beginning here, we have I. It's the very first word of the novel, importantly. This is a story, it's very important that it is told in the first person. First person, as I always say, can be a little limiting, but not when we really are talking about a book that is so confessional and that is so much about, the interior life and the thoughts of this person, David. He's also someone who is very articulate, especially very good with figurative language. And it's a very revealing and I think a really appropriate and essential narrative stance. So we have at the beginning here, I stand at the window. So right away we have him facing this window. So windows are important. They're almost one of those kind of liminal spaces, whereas liminal spaces just being places like doorways or hallways or train stations where movement and transition, evolution may or may not occur. But in this case, we have him looking at the window. So that is signaling that he is cut off from something, that there's a certain amount of longing. He can see through the window onto the south of France, but he's disconnected from it. And importantly, on the other side of the window, night is falling. So the idea of night falling is also very important because it speaks to things ending. It speaks to the darkness of this story. And in fact, night is particularly important here because he mentions that this is, the night before the worst morning of his life. So you have this idea of real impending doom and darkness. Also, once the night has fallen, it's very important because then he begins to see his reflection in the window. So a window, if you can see through it as a character, it's one thing, but certainly if it's a nighttime window and you are reflected by the window, it's very important. So it's not quite a mirror. We're going to look at mirrors. Mirrors seem like very kind of obvious symbols to me in literature, but windows that are darkened, it's signals, I think, sometimes that a narrator doesn't want to fully face themselves. The narrator's not quite ready to actually look in a mirror and purposefully see themselves reflected. This is kind of this oblique way that even if he doesn't want himself reflected, he is being reflected back upon himself, almost against his will. Very interestingly, at the end of the novel, and we will look at this, we have him still standing at this window. We have this same window at the end of the novel, but then he chooses, in fact, to look at himself in a mirror. And that does not happen until the very end of the novel. And you get the sense, or at least you should, that is because he is finally ready to see himself in this mirror. He's ready to learn more about himself and to accept more about himself and to see himself more clearly than he would see himself in a darkened window. So then we have this description of him that is very interesting. The idea of tall, perhaps rather like an arrow. You have this idea here of like a straight arrow, someone who's like a straight shooter. I don't think straight shooter and straight arrow are the same thing. But, someone who's kind of traditional and someone who has like a lot of quote unquote integrity, you have this idea of him as being an arrow. But you also have the idea of an arrow as being something in motion and something that is shot away from you. You also have an evocation of Cupid here, Cupid's arrow. All of these different connotations should be, you may not have studied this first paragraph the way that we are right now, and that is absolutely fine. But when you stop and look carefully at a writer like James Baldwin, these are the kinds of allusions that you can tease out of something like the arrow. We also, the fact that he's tall and he's straight and that he is standing, all of this, imagine if he were lying down or if he were sitting or if he were swimming, the fact that he is standing straight, you have a sense of him waiting, you have a sense of like impending, something. It's a very, very good and important description. We also have this idea here, my blonde hair gleams. So that is an important way right from the beginning that we are signaling that this is not a Black person. And then we go on to have this description of him that really situates him as American, and not only American, but the kind of American who is the result of manifest destiny and, the westward expansion, because we have this. My face is like a face you've seen many times. My ancestors conquered a continent, pushing across death-laden plains until they came to an ocean, which faced away from Europe into a darker past. This is just an absolutely crucial sentence. It's very important that it comes at the end of the first paragraph of the opening of the novel. So this idea of my people conquered a continent, you have this sense there of a percussive sound, this conquered the continent that's very forceful. You have the alliteration. It's a very bold statement and a very kind of, in some ways, incriminating statement about his ancestors having conquered this whole entire continent and having wreaked a lot of havoc. With this death-laden plains, we have the idea of the native peoples, and then getting to the end of the continent facing away away from Europe into a darker past. So Europe, Americans think that like our history is very young because in fact we didn't come, as English colonists, we didn't come to the United States until relatively recently. Of course, this continent has been inhabited for millennia. But to say that our history is darker than Europe's is really important because, of course, Europe has its own darknesses. But the idea of having exterminated the native peoples, and then, of course, the idea of enslavement are ways that Americans and our American history should be read in some ways as darker than Europe. It's important to remember at this point, too, that Baldwin has taken refuge in Europe because he is seeking a place where racial prejudice might not be quite as intense. We aren't going to look at the entire opening this closely, but then you have the notion of the train and the fact that he is leaving the South and going back to Paris. And the description of the train is important because being in the train with the other people, again, a train is a liminal space. It's one that is both private and public. You have your own seat, but you are essentially in the public space. It's a space where a lot of intimacy can happen. You can flirt with people. There are recruits on this train. And we have right from the start this sense of our narrator as being interested in both men and women. We don't even know yet why it's the worst day of his life. And we don't know that he has been with first Joey, the young man in David's, long ago in his past. And we don't know he is with Giovanni. We only know at that point this notion of the girl on the train who is going to be confused because he won't be flirting with her. We very soon realize that he has been in the South with Hella, who is his fiancée, although we do know even from the start that she is now sailing back to America. You have a lot of motion, but you have it all tied up with this idea of men and women and flirtation or not flirtation. And also the idea of being very still while on the train is speaking to contradiction. It's speaking to discomfort. It's just a very, very loaded and intricate and really incredibly well done opening to the novel. We're now going to move on and talk about instances of figurative language and how important they are, but you get a sense from the beginning of the accumulation of really telling and really well done figurative language. So we're going to move from the beginning to dive in, to water. We're going to dive in, no pun intended, dive into water as a symbol. So there's a lot of references to the sea and to the ocean. We've already seen that beginning in the very opening pages, but also water itself is something that you see all the time. There are a couple of different points where our narrator David is talking about how time is different when he is in Giovanni's room, and it feels like things are happening underwater. There's a very sort of submarine thing that is happening when they are in the room, which I think speaks to mystery, and it speaks to a space that is totally ancient in many ways and beyond time, and that just functions entirely differently than life on land. We're going to look at two passages that have to do with water. This is on page 22, relatively early in the novel. My father had money in his account which belonged to me, but he was very reluctant to send it because he wanted me to come home. To come home, as he said, and settle down. And whenever he said that, I thought of the sediment at the bottom of a stagnant pond. So this is so beautiful. Again, we have lots of references to the ocean, and here they are totally contrasted with the idea of sediment at the bottom of a pond. So he's hearing his father exhorting him to come home and settle down, which of course settling down in that context means getting married and having children and getting a job. At this point, David is in Europe with his fiancée, who is now in Spain, taking a break to figure out what is happening between the two of them. But this idea of these words as feeling like sediment are so important because right away it is cluing us in a very beautiful and lyrical way to how he's feeling about becoming, a husband and a father and a homeowner would be like being at the bottom of a stagnant pond. And then right across the way, we have this. I had written to friends for money, of course, but the Atlantic Ocean is deep and wide and money doesn't hurry from the other side. I love the way that even rhymes. All of the writing is so, it's really working hard, and there is never a missed opportunity to have it just be beautiful as well as very telling. But here we have this contrast, the Atlantic Ocean being deep and wide. It's the opposite of this stagnant pond. It is what is separating him from, the notion of settling down. But we also have here the personification of money. This idea of money doesn't hurry from the other side. That's a very, money can't hurry, but it's giving money agency, which is very important because money is important all throughout the entire novel. But this idea of personifying it adds to the depth with which he is using his figurative language. We have another really great example of water on page 45. It's the morning after he has met Giovanni. He is with these two older gay men. They are in this bar together, and then they are all going to have breakfast together. And suddenly things are feeling kind of seedy and salacious to him. We were going to Les Halles for breakfast. We piled into a taxi, the four of us, unpleasantly crowded together, a circumstance which elicited from Jacques and Guillaume a series of lewd speculations. This lewdness was particularly revolting in that it not only failed of wit, it was so clearly an expression of contempt and self-contempt. It bubbled upward out of them like a fountain of black water. This is such an important image, and it's tied very closely with a very important concept. So the idea of black water bubbling like a fountain, a fountain should be, beautiful, and they are used, decoratively, and, you would always have pure water. And here you have, in fact, black water, which is very different. You also, of course, with the fountain, you have the idea of ejaculation. You have the idea of water spurting out of this thing. And fountains can often be fairly phallic. Not always, obviously, but sometimes. The idea of this black water is tied very closely to this idea of contempt and self-contempt. And that is such a crucial, crucial moment because, in fact, these men with whom David is spending a lot of time and is drawn to them sexually, you do have this idea of contempt and self-contempt. And they also, I think, have a lot of contempt for different kinds of gay men, whether they're too feminized or whether they are, different in whatever way than David is. So those are examples of water, but now we're going to take a closer look at some uses of the ocean that are incredibly important. So we have one on page 6. It's important to remember this is very early in the novel, and this is when David is talking very candidly about his very first experience of having sex with a man, well, with a boy. This is when he was young and he was with another boy named Joey. I repent now, for all the good it does, one particular lie among the many lies I've told, lived, and believed. This is the lie which I told to Giovanni but never succeeded in making him believe, that I had never slept with a boy before. I had decided that I never would again. There is something fantastic in the spectacle I now present to myself of having run so far, so hard, across the ocean even, only to find myself brought up short once more before the bulldog in my own backyard. The yard, in the meantime, having grown smaller and the bulldog bigger. So this is so crucial. One of the things in the very beginning, we have this idea that he is repenting. Repenting? Is that what he says? Yes, I repent now. It's a very serious kind of, responsibility he's taking. So he is repenting, but then in this M- phrase, and M- being my favorite punctuation mark, we have for all the good it does. So this is ratcheting up the tension because we don't know what has happened at this point. We don't know what is going on with Giovanni. We only know that they are separated. So you have this sense of like, uh-oh, like he's repenting, but it's definitely too late. And then we have the idea of being very frank with the reader, with the idea of Joey, but not being frank with Giovanni about it, about lying to Giovanni, but Giovanni, of course, seeing through the lie. And then you have this beautiful idea of him running so far, so fast, across the ocean even. This idea of the ocean as being this vast body of water that is really separating his life in Europe from this idea of settling down. It really becomes kind of this dividing point in lots of ways. So he had run across it, and you have this idea of walking on water, although I don't think he's really going for like a Jesus thing here. But you have this idea of him even having done something impossible, which is to run on the ocean. And then we get to this whole other metaphor, which is the idea of the bulldog in his backyard, and this idea of the backyard having gotten smaller and the bulldog getting bigger. So you have this combination here of figurative language that's actually fairly typical. There's lots and lots of figurative language that we're not going to talk about today, simply because there are other uses of figurative language we're going to focus on more carefully. So this might be a bit of a spoiler. It's not really that much of a spoiler, but if you're worried about, being spoiled, maybe skip ahead a minute or two. This comes at the very end of the book on page 161. I think the book is 167 pages long, 169. This is, at the end when Hela and David are having this very difficult discussion about their relationship. Just let me be a woman. Take me. It's what I want. It's all I want. I don't care about anything else. She moved toward me. I stood perfectly still. She touched me, raising her face with a desperate and terribly moving trust to mine. Don't throw me back into the sea, David. Let me stay here with you. So this idea of being thrown back in the sea is something we hear her saying on page 161, but we now, because we are looking at this so closely, remember that she is in fact crossing the Atlantic. So she essentially has been thrown back into the sea. She means it here, this idea of more fish in the sea, and this idea of not being together anymore, and this idea of her having to begin over with this pursuit to find a husband. She wants to have children. She wants to settle down. So, but you have this metaphorical idea of also being at sea. This being out at sea is that idea of being kind of helpless and being lost. So it's this very moving use here of the ocean. We're going to look at one more. So this last one is actually about boats. It's not so much about the ocean, but it's during this time when Hela is talking to David and is just really, having a difficult time because, in fact, she wishes they could be together. It's a really interesting meditation, this book, on what it is to be a woman. At one point when David decides, in fact, to marry Hela, he refers to her in a letter to his father as the little woman. And you have this sense that Hela understands that becoming a woman in the sense of like settling down and having children and, running a household, it will be limiting in lots of ways. And yet it's a limitation that she is willing and somewhat eager to embrace. So she says here, there are women who have forgotten that to be a woman doesn't simply mean humiliation, doesn't simply mean bitterness. I haven't forgotten it yet, she added, in spite of you. I'm not going to forget it. I'm getting out of this house, away from you, just as fast as taxis, trains, and boats will carry me. So importantly, we have the idea of this house that they have rented as kind of their last ditch. It's houses are oftentimes symbolic, and they certainly are in this. So in the beginning, they don't have a house together. They're staying in a hotel, which is very transitory, very liminal. And when they do, in fact, go to the south of France and establish a home together, that is symbolic in many ways. Whenever you come across a house in literature, you should always take a step back and ask yourself, what is it symbolic of? In this case, it is a rented home. It is a home that we never get a very good description of. It is a home where he is spending all of his time looking out the window. So you have this sense of the home as essentially not being theirs and not being something that is very clear to anyone. And then here we have this idea of her getting out of the house. So she is leaving, their domestic arrangement, leaving their relationship as fast as taxis, trains, and boats will carry me. So those are all conveyances, and it's kind of in the order in which she will have to, do them in order to get back to the United States. But of course, the idea of the boat is leading us to the idea of this vast Atlantic and the symbolism of the Atlantic as being sort of the defining space between Europe, which means lots of freedom, and she's been in Spain by herself, and being able to move freely as a woman, and moving away from that kind of freedom in Europe towards a much more sort of conventional and traditional, existence as a wife and mother and homemaker in the United States. So the use of birds in literature is also very interesting if the writer is worth her salt. or his salt in this case. So birds, when you come across a bird in literature, there are lots of different birds that mean different things. A swallow always returns, that kind of thing. A cuckoo is cuckoo. All of those, there are different nuances given different birds. But one thing to think about always is whether or not it's a domestic bird or whether it is in fact a wild bird. And James Baldwin does such an amazing job with birds. We're going to look at these pretty briefly. On page 8, this was one of my very favorite descriptions of the entire book. It's just so telling and so beautiful. It's just such a good way to convey what he is trying to say. This is when it's very early in the book. It's only page 8, and it's when he is with Joey, this other boy, where he really has his own sexual awakening. Joey raised his head as I lowered mine, and we kissed, as it were, by accident. Then, for the first time in my life, I was really aware of another person's body, of another person's smell. We had our arms around each other. It was like holding in my hand some rare, exhausted, nearly doomed bird which I had miraculously happened to find. It's so beautiful. I mean, the idea of holding a bird in your hand is so unusual. And then also this idea of it being sort of this nearly doomed bird really speaks from the very beginning of the difficulties that David understands that he will be facing as as a man who is attracted to other men in the early 50s. By the way, I was very interested in whether or not sodomy was a crime in France in this era. And in fact, during the French Revolution, they got rid of any kind of legislation against sodomy. So France is often known as at least in terms of its laws, as being more gay friendly than some other countries. It's obviously more gay friendly than a lot of countries. But they did have a period then, it's probably around the Vichy government and the Second World War and kind of the movement toward the right that happened then. But there were some rules at that point that criminalized male sexual activity. It had to do with the pissoirs, which were it's like the gay bathhouses here in the United States. The pissoirs were urinals. They were public urinals that are still in France. They're amazing. But at that time, they were places where a lot of gay male experiences were occurring. But by 1956, when this was published, they had lifted all of that legislation. So, it's not a crime. What they're doing is not a crime technically, and yet for David, who his father has very clear expectations for his future, it's a difficult thing to come to terms with. So not long after this beautiful description of the doomed bird, we have our narrator, David, giving us a description of the scene in this gay bar where he is. So there are a bunch of different sort of types of gay men there, and he is giving a description of all these different types of men, and he says this. There were, of course, les folles, always dressed in the most improbable combinations, screaming like parrots the details of their latest love affairs. So folle in this case is Folles. So that's a French word. It means the crazy ladies. So in English, we have that very famous movie, Les Cages aux Folles. So that means basically I think the translation into English of that movie was the bird cage, but Les Cages aux Folles is like a cage of crazy women. So it's important here that the cage is referring, you would have birds in a cage, and then he's underscoring that idea by calling them parrots, saying that they are screaming like parrots. So, for an American, you do have that idea of les cages aux folles. And then part of the same paragraph, we have this. Then all of the others closed in on this newcomer, and they looked like a peacock garden and sounded like a barnyard. So this idea of a peacock, very famously, there's a peahen, which is kind of like a plain-looking brown bird, and then we have the peacock, which has that, beautiful peacock fanned-out tail, which really speaks to, this kind of showy maleness. But it's important here that it is it's a bird. We're talking about different types of birds. And of course, when you think of birds in English parlance, meaning British English, you have the idea of birds as referring to women. So all of these comparisons with birds should also be sort of low-key reminding you of the fact that birds are often referring to women as kind of a sexual object. We then have one last description of a bird that's actually a very sad description. It's toward the very end of the novel on page 146. This is a bit of a spoiler if you're concerned. David is describing his experience with Hella. We stayed in her room. We made love a lot. We went to the movies and had long, frequently rather melancholy dinners in strange restaurants on the right bank. It is hard to say what produced this melancholy, which sometimes settled over us like the shadow of some vast, some predatory, waiting bird. So the last word in a sentence is always important. It's important that this whole description of this melancholy is moving toward the word bird here. And you get the sense of this bird of prey, but the melancholy idea and the idea of it waiting is just sort of haunting and terrible in many ways. Even just from the title of the novel, we understand that the room is in fact very significant. It is significant too that it's Giovanni's room. It's not his bedroom, and you get the sense that it's not quite a studio. It's not like it has a kitchenette or something in there, but you get the sense that everything is happening there. He wants his bookcase. He has some sort of fireplace. His bed takes up the majority of the space, but there's newspapers everywhere. In fact, we have a very cluttered and in some ways a very unclear vision of this room, which makes sense. So in lots of ways, this is sort of the most intimate space that Giovanni has, and he in fact is inviting David in a very sexualized way, which signals how that space is in fact very private. So we're going to look at the first time that David goes into the room, and it's so interesting. His room was in the back, on the ground floor of the last building on this street. We passed the vestibule and the elevator into a short, dark corridor which led to his room. The room was small. I only made out the outlines of clutter and disorder. There was the smell of alcohol he burned in his stove. He locked the door behind us, and then for a moment in the gloom, we simply stared at each other, with dismay, with relief, and breathing hard. So we have this sense here. This is such an interesting description. He is, first of all, it's in the back of the house, and it's the last house on the street. You get the sense that this is kind of like the very, very last option, essentially that David has moved through all of these other things and is finally going to take on this last thing he wants. And then, very interesting, they pass by the elevator. They're not going to rise up. They're going backward toward the back of the house, and they pass through a dark corridor into the room. So I think in some ways you could read this as, the dark corridor as being a space of kind of birth, either like the birth canal, and that he is being birthed into his relationship with Giovanni, or you could look at it almost as like a womb-like space in the sense of this kind of perfect communion between the two of them. I myself see it a little bit more like a birth of their relationship, that they move through the corridor and David is sort of reborn as a man who is in a physical relationship with another man. Of course, the thing itself is gloomy. It's also important that Giovanni is locking the door behind him. All of these descriptions and all of these details that Baldwin is giving us are really crucial. So on page 114, the room really comes into focus. I'm going to read this. And interestingly here, we have three different metaphors. They're kind of back to back to back. Here we go. Those days after Giovanni had lost his job, we dawdled as doomed mountain climbers may be said to dawdle above the chasm held only by a snapping rope. Here, of course, we have an echo of the word doomed, just like that doomed bird that David held in his hand. But the idea here of mountain climbers being suspended above a chasm, I mean, the stakes are very high, and it's a very, precipitous and kind of dangerous situation that they are sort of, suspended above. Day after day, we lingered in that room, and Giovanni began to work on it again. He had some weird idea that it would be nice to have a bookcase sunk in the wall, and he chipped through the wall until he came to brick and began pounding away at the brick. It was hard work, it was insane work, but I did not have the energy or the heart to stop him. In a way, he was doing it for me, to prove his love for me. He wanted me to stay in the room with him. Perhaps he was trying, with his own strength, to push back the encroaching walls without, however, having the walls fall down. It's so beautiful. I mean, here Baldwin is really handing us the symbolic nature of this room, on a platter, as it were. But this idea of Giovanni as wanting to change the room, this idea of chipping away at the walls without wanting them to fall down, and of course the idea of running into brick, and then running into a brick wall here is a very clear metaphor for how difficult this is, and in fact how futile. We're going to look at one more description of the room. So this is kind of a different type of figurative language. It's called dramatic irony. And this is simply when it comes actually from drama, like from ancient Greek drama, but it comes from the idea that the reader, in this case, knows information that the characters don't. So in this case, it's one of my favorite kinds of figurative language because it's very effective in sort of drawing the reader in, because you are basically aligning the reader with one of your characters, and the reader and that character are kind of in cahoots against, not against, but they share information that other characters don't have. On page 134, this is a discussion between David and Hella. And the way that the room features in this is it's simply, it's named, but when you hear it named, it has special significance because it is the title of the book. I always love it when there is like an actual example of the title of the book recurring, simply because it does give me a little frisson. It's like a little charge that you get when you see it there. So he's sort of defending Giovanni to Hella in this bit of dialogue. I'm beginning to see, I said carefully, that kids like Giovanni are in a difficult position. This isn't, the land of opportunity. There's no provision made for them. I've been living in Giovanni's room for months, I said, and I just can't stand it anymore. I have to get out of there, please. She laughed nervously and moved slightly away from me. I mean, so symbolic. She laughed nervously and is stepping away from him. I mean, it's simple blocking here. It's just like what's happening, but it's so weighty. She laughed nervously. Well, I don't really see why getting out of Giovanni's room means getting out of Paris. I mean, this repetition of it, again, really is adding some weight to it. And then a little further down, I'm an American, Hella. He thinks I'm rich. And he's got this thing about me. He thinks I'm God. And that room is so stinking and dirty. And soon winter will be here and it's going to be cold. And then the dialogue breaks off. So the fact that autumn and winter are approaching are obviously also symbolic. I mean, there is so much in this book that we are not going to get to. But the reason why I read this is not because it's a description of the room itself, but simply because of the room as being symbolic of the relationship, and the way that David is so ambivalent about it, both drawn to it kind of inexorably, but also, in fact, repelled by things like the smell and the dimness and the idea of needing to escape from that space because he sort of can't accept himself. We'll look at one last description of the room and then look at mirrors as a way to close. So even further along on page 140, we have this description of the two of them in one of the last times when they are in Giovanni's room. Don't leave me, please don't leave me. I turned and held him in my arms, staring above his head at the wall, at the man and the woman on the wall who walked together among roses. He was sobbing, it would have been said, as though his heart would break. But I felt that it was my heart which was broken. Something had broken in me to make me so cold and so perfectly still and far away. So this idea of the man and the woman walking in roses, this is actually like a callback. He, when he's first talking about the room, he describes this wallpaper with this motif of the man and the woman walking together. You could almost say it's kind of like a heavy-handed symbol there, but I just love it. So, the fact that it's part of the wallpaper is like, that expression, like you hardly even see it anymore because it's so much a part of the fabric of your life. But here we have this idea of this man and woman walking together. It's sort of like that heteronormative trope that is repeated over and over and over on the wallpaper of their of Giovanni's room. And the idea of these roses and roses symbolizing love. I mean, it's a very kind of upfront idea of these two men as being really confronted by this image of what sort of like heteronormative couples would look like. It's so touching. And then here, the fact that we have this man and the woman and the wallpaper, and then immediately are following it with the idea of the broken heart, and the fact that both of their hearts are broken. I mean, that's obviously another kind of metaphor, but in this case, it's one that is so well known and so well kind of trod that we don't even really think of it as a metaphor, although it is important to remember that in fact it is. We're going to now move on and just talk about mirrors very briefly. We looked in the very beginning at this idea of him standing at the window and then night falling, so darkness, kind of like winter coming. You have this idea of night falling, and then he sees his reflection. And that reflection, in fact, he sees his blonde hair, he sees how kind of straight arrow he is, but he doesn't have a very clear vision of himself yet, because in fact he is just reflected in this dark window. But then at the end of the novel, we have this really moving part where the narrator is sort of returning back to the very first pages. So at the very end of the novel, he's talking about standing at that window again. This is why there's a circularity to the novel that I really love, and it's why it's so interesting to go back and look at the beginning. But we have this sense then of him as looking at himself again in this window and being reflected, but then choosing to go and see himself in a mirror. On page 168, this is the very end. The body in the mirror forces me to turn and face it, and I look at my body, which is under sentence of death. It is lean, hard, and cold, the incarnation of a mystery. And I do not know what moves in this body, what this body is searching. It is trapped in my mirror as it is trapped in time, and it hurries toward revelation. I long to make this prophecy come true. And then we have the final two paragraphs on the very last page of the book. I move at last from the mirror and begin to cover that nakedness which I must hold sacred, though it be never so vile, which must be scoured perpetually with the salt of my life. I must believe that the heavy grace of God, which has brought me to this place, is all that can carry me out of it. And at last I step out into the morning, and I lock the door behind me. I cross the road and drop the keys into the old lady's mailbox, and I look up the road where a few people stand, men and women waiting for the morning bus. They are very vivid beneath the awakening sky, and the horizon beyond them is beginning to flame. The morning weighs on my shoulders with the dreadful weight of hope, and I take the blue envelope which Jacques has sent me and tear it slowly into many pieces, watching them dance in the wind, watching the wind carry them away. Yet, as I turn and begin walking toward the waiting people, the wind blows some of them back on me. It's such a beautiful close, and it is absolutely just saturated with beautiful figurative language. We have the beginning, his nakedness, which of course is also his sexuality, but also his emotional vulnerability. And we have this idea of clothing that nakedness, but also retaining some sort of hope. We have him turning both toward God and also toward hope, in the sense that dawn is approaching, the light outside is rising, and we have this very prosaic description of men and women together, which is both, I think, sort of fatalistic in the sense that he is returning to some sort of heteronormative world. We have another sort of conveyance here. We have the bus. We have this idea of him finally moving. And then, of course, the importance of the envelope, which I'm not going to spoil it for you, and it's sort of obvious if you have read the book what that envelope is. But there's a lot of personification with the idea of the torn envelope dancing in the wind, and that's kind of a happy-ish kind of thing. And then, of course, the wind also personified in pulling it back to him. So we have this sense that Giovanni will always be with him, and we also have a sense of hope. If you can hear that dog. There's a dog outside barking. So I'm just going to wrap up today. I was almost done anyway. I don't know what's wrong with that dog. But it does feel very important to say at the end here, we have this beautiful accumulation of all of these different figurative language examples that are sort of part and parcel with the rest of the novel, and how beautifully James Baldwin manages all of these different types of figurative language to reveal so much about the characters and about the situation and about hope and despair and desire. It's just absolutely beautiful. So thank you very much for tuning in. Happy reading.